What I want to talk about right now for a few minutes is actually something that comes up a lot. A little bit of confusion about it, but it's really, really, really simple. And that is, there's more than four, but I want to talk about, ooh, there's a cool lenticular, ooh, look at these lenticular clouds. I don't know if you can see out the window. Really cool. And that is the main big four types of airspeeds that we talk about in flight training. So again, if you're starting flight training or if you have been flight training and the airspeeds still confuse you, let me simplify it for you. We'll break them down together and we'll actually show why each airspeed shows what it shows. And we'll go ahead and hopefully put an end to the airspeed confusion once and for all. So the four airspeeds are the famous ones: indicated airspeed, calibrated airspeed, true airspeed, and ground speed. Indicated, calibrated, true, and ground. Let's start with indicated airspeed. Indicated airspeed is what?
Vertical track.
So my VNAV should begin a descent here in a minute. Indicated airspeed is nothing more and nothing less than the airspeed that is indicated on my airspeed indicator. So guess what? Here's my airspeed indicator, and that's my indicated airspeed. Right now, it's fluctuating 128 to 131. It's kind of going up and down as the winds are shifting. That's my indicated airspeed. Indicated airspeed is probably the easiest speed to understand. It's the speed that shows on my TV screen. That's it. It's the indicated, that's why it's called the indicated airspeed. It's the speed that is indicated on my screen. Now, calibrated airspeed is where things get a little interesting. It's really, really simple, but people, for some reason, there's a little confusion about it. If we know a little bit about how indicated airspeed is generated, it's generated, let me see why. Look at that. Huh. Interesting. There we go. If we know anything about how indicated airspeed is generated, well, indicated airspeed is generated as a result of air molecules ramming through our pitot tube, put simply. So the more air molecules ram through the pitot tube, the higher of an indication will be generated or indicated on our airspeed indicator. Less air molecules ramming through it, the lower the indication. So that's indicated airspeed. So let's think about it for a second. The first part of a pitot tube is it's a mechanical device, and we know with any mechanical device, it's never going to be perfect. So there's going to be some amount of error that is associated or that is in existence between the pitot tube taking in those air molecules and the indicated airspeed generating that indicated airspeed indication. So with calibrated airspeed, it's a mechanical device, but also if we think about it, the pitot tube is fixed to the airplane. So what that means is if I'm flying straight, then the pitot tube is pointing straight. But check this out. We know that in an airplane, think of slow flight, I could point up but move straight. Or I could crab into the wind but move this way through the air. So unlike a car in an airplane, we could point and move in two different directions if we think about it. So we already have a problem that's cooking up over here. And the problem is this. Well, if I move and point in the same direction, then my pitot tube is moving and pointing in the same direction. Therefore, the oncoming air, which we call relative wind, its air molecules are ramming into my pitot tube head on because my plane or pitot tube is pointing straight into the wind that I'm flying through. But what happens if I'm moving and pointing in different directions? Now the relative wind is not hitting my pitot tube head on. It's hitting my fuselage, or it's hitting the side of the pitot tube, or it's hitting under it. Therefore, generating an indication that is not completely accurate. Because if we had the ability to move the pitot tube to point straight towards the relative wind, opposite and parallel to our flight path, our indication would be different. So calibrated airspeed is this. It's indicated airspeed, plus it takes into account that error that comes along with the airplane not being pointed directly into the relative wind. The POH breaks it down in the airspeed calibration chart into flaps and no flaps in the various flap settings. And the reason is our pitch attitude changes drastically at a given airspeed with a given flap setting. And there's 5, and I could proceed on course, and I'll go to nav. Our pitot tube, or our pitch attitude, changes drastically with flap settings at different airspeeds. So the POH breaks it down into calibrated and indicated along with various flap settings for that exact reason, because in an airplane we could point and move in different directions. So one thing I'll say about calibrated airspeed, when you come in to land with a forward slip to landing, have you ever done that? And you maintain that indicated airspeed on your screen that you always do, but then when you straighten the plane out, you float it halfway down the runway? Why is that? The answer is you were going much faster through the air than your screen was telling you. And the reason your screen was lying to you...
Number 2, Romeo, contact Los Angeles Center, LA Center.
The reason your screen was lying to you was because because the pitot tube was not pointing directly into the relative wind, because your plane was pointing there, but moving this way towards the runway. And remember, the pitot tube is fixed to the airplane, and it moves when the plane moves. So next time you forward slip into landing, maintain a speed of about 5 knots or so slower than your typical approach speed on the screen, and that way when you straighten out, you won't float halfway down the runway. So that's a little bit about calibrated airspeed. True airspeed refers to the actual speed I'm flying through an air mass. So right now, the air all around me is an air mass, and within it, there's air molecules that I'm flying through. Air masses are made up of different properties, different temperatures, different pressures. So within each given air mass, at a given temperature and pressure, let me get a nice descent here. Every single air mass is made up of different properties. Some air masses have higher pressure, some have low. And what that does to the air molecules is some air masses have the air molecules closer to each other, it's more dense, and some have it further away from each other. It's less dense. So check this out. Let's bring it back to the beginning where we talked about indicated airspeed. If indicated airspeed is a speed that is generated on our screen as a result of air molecules ramming through our pitot tube, well, let's think about it this way. We have 2 air masses. One air mass has high density, high pressure. Another air mass is lower density, low pressure. The air mass with the high density, high pressure has the air molecules closer to each other. The air mass with the low density, lower pressure has the air molecules further away. Okay. Now we need to fly through the air to maintain, say, 100 knots. In which of these air masses would I have to actually move faster through the air mass to hit enough air molecules through my pitot tube to generate 100 knots? In the air mass that has the air molecules closer to each other or further away? The answer is, in the air mass that has the air molecules further apart, less dense, I'd have to fly faster through the air mass in order to ram into enough of those molecules to generate the 100-knot indication. But if I flew through the air mass that had a higher density, higher pressure, the air molecules are closer together, I can get away with flying slower through that air mass, moving slower through the air mass, while still generating a 100-knot indication, because the air molecules are closer to each other, so I could go slower and yet hit enough of them through my pitot tube. And that is why we have a difference between indicated and true, because they're not every air mass means, not every indicated airspeed means I'm flying the same speed through the air. So if I only had indicated, I wouldn't know really how fast I'm flying. And if I only had true, I wouldn't be able to control the airplane properly, well, if I had an angle of attack indicator. But the reason we have the indicated airspeed is because it keeps things constant. Every single landing is done at the same speed. Every single takeoff, same speed. No matter where or what density altitude I'm operating out of, because it's compensated for by either an increase or a decrease in true airspeed. So here's true airspeed. True airspeed is the speed I fly through an air mass, hitting those air molecules to ram them through my pitot tube to generate a given indicated. So the last thing I'll say about true,
November 0 Golf Tango contact.
To wrap it up,
132.5.
any given flight, when you take off and climb up to altitude, At altitude, as the higher up you go, are the air molecules closer to each other or further apart? The answer is the air is less dense, they're further apart. So what that means is if you're climbing and maintaining a constant indicated airspeed, the higher up you go, guess what happens to your true? You must increase your true airspeed more and more and more and more in order to maintain that same rate of hitting the air molecules as you fly higher and higher into less dense air. So I hope that relationship, that connection between what true airspeed is and what indicated airspeed is makes sense to you. And I also hope that the relationship between indicated and calibrated makes sense to you. I hope these things are simplifying in your head a little bit. Now the final speed that we'll talk about right now is ground speed. Now ground speed, I said before, indicated is the easiest one to wrap your head around.
Vertical track.
Because all it is the speed that your TV is showing you, which is right here. Ground speed is also easy to wrap your head around. And all the ground speed is it's the speed that your airplane is moving over the ground. That's all it is. So what that means is if your friend was on the ground looking up and you were flying over them, ground speed is the speed at which you flew over them, you passed them by. So the question is, well, isn't that true airspeed? So the answer is yes and no. Ground speed and true airspeed are the same exact speed when there's no wind either pushing you or holding you back, pushing against you.
November 15 Golf, change to my frequency 120.25.
120.25, 15 Golf. And approach 15 Golf with you.
15 Golf, roger, tail angle 2969.
2969 or 15 Golf. Ground speed and true airspeed are the same when there's no wind, meaning there's no headwind or tailwind. True airspeed and ground speed change when there's a headwind or tailwind. So when I have a tailwind pushing me along, my true airspeed stays what it is, right? Because that's how fast I'm actually flying through the air mass. But I'm moving over the ground at a faster rate.
1922 Joshua,
because while within the air mass I'm moving at the same true, the air mass with me in it is moving over the ground. So now not only is the plane moving in the air mass, but the air mass with the plane moving in it is moving over the ground. So when your friend looks up and sees you flying over them with a tailwind, they can't see the air mass because it's invisible, but imagine this, imagine the air mass being a balloon and the plane being inside the balloon. True airspeed is how fast I'm flying through the balloon. Ground speed is how fast the balloon with me in it is tracking over the ground with a tailwind or a headwind. So with a headwind, it's the opposite. When I have a headwind, it's holding me back. So I'm flying through the balloon, but the balloon is coming towards me, flying backwards a little bit, so now my ground speed decreases by the amount of headwind. So I hope these four little airspeeds, I don't know why I said little, but I hope these four airspeeds make a little better sense to you right now than they did before. Indicated airspeed is what my screen shows. Calibrated airspeed is what my screen shows if there were no error in this mechanical device, but really also it corrects, it makes up for that error that results due to my pitot tube being fixed to my airplane. And as we know in a plane, a few examples off the top of my head: forward slip to a landing, different flap settings at different airspeeds, as well as slow flight. All these different pitch attitudes and slips result in the airplane, or even wind correction angle, great example, result in a plane pointing and moving in different directions. And that results in the air molecules not ramming head-on into the pitot tube. So there's an error that is generated as a result of that. True airspeed is literally how fast I'm moving through the air mass, ramming into the air molecules. So when an air mass with the air molecules are further apart, I have to fly faster to maintain a given indicated. In an air mass where the air molecules are closer together, I can get away flying slower. And finally, ground speed. There's 4,000 coming up. And finally, let's maintain 45. And finally, ground speed is how fast I'm actually moving over the ground, either with the air mass's movement as well, or against it, depending if there's headwinds or tailwinds. The last thing I'll say about this with the true and indicated, When I say an air mass that's air molecules are further away from each other, think of landing at a high density altitude airport in the mountains. The air molecules are further apart. But guess what speed you maintain on landing? Same indicated airspeed that you would maintain at sea level. But at high density altitude, in order for your plane to maintain that same amount of air molecules ramming through the pitot tube, the same rate to maintain lift or flight at that high density altitude, because the air molecules are so far apart, I have to move so much faster through the air mass to hit them fast enough to generate that indicated. And that's why your ground speed or ground roll landing distance is much higher, both on landing and takeoff at a high density altitude airport. So I hope it all makes sense, the different airspeeds. Nothing too complicated. Watch this video again and again and again if you have to. But there you have it. 4 airspeeds: indicated, calibrated, true, and ground. Nothing too insane. And next time in your plane, actually look at the numbers. So we're 108 indicated, we're 120 true, so we're actually moving through the air mass at 120 knots, ramming into enough air molecules to generate 110 knots. And we have a tailwind of 27 knots, which results in our ground speed being 147, 146. And there you have it. Airspeeds. And that's about that. I hope that all makes sense.